What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the First Class Lacrosse Podcast. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Stephen Rehfuss and Matt Dunn. We came off an exciting weekend, amazing quarterfinal games in the men's and the women's brackets. Probably one of the best weekends of lacrosse in my lifetime, or at least of what I can really remember, and a lot to look forward to with the upcoming semifinals and finals and championship weekend. Guys, welcome to the show. Excited to chop it up today.
Thanks, Deemer. Yeah, today's simple format, right? Breaking down the quarterfinals, looking ahead at some of the Final Four matchups here, maybe recapping some things we saw both previous matchups, at least on the men's side this year. To your point, none of those quarterfinal games disappointed, right? I mean, maybe depending on who you rooted for, but I think on the men's side, all four of those games were close games. They were all different, high scoring, low scoring, down to the wire, and four are probably the best games I've watched in a little while.
This weekend was awesome. This podcast will obviously look a little bit different. I think, Matt, you did a really good job just organizing the podcast throughout the year and us hitting different segments. Obviously, it's a little bit different now with just four teams left playing, on the men's and women's side each. I was in Long Island or on Long Island at Hofstra for the games. I caught a decent amount of the Cornell one, caught the whole Syracuse-Princeton game. Just wanted to give a shout out. And Matt, you've been really, really high on Richmond, I think the entire season. But that was the first time I saw them play live. They're a really impressive group right there defensively. They were incredible. A lot of the times, a couple of people in the stands were like, wow, I feel like this Richmond team looks like Maryland right now. These guys are legit. They definitely had Cornell on their heels from a body language perspective, but Cornell got into that at the end. But Matt, would love any commentary. It doesn't even have to be on this game in particular, but just Richmond as a whole. I think you've been really high on them all year.
Yeah, well, my brother went to Richmond, graduated in 2022. So obviously I'm a Maryland fan, but after that, I'm a big Spiders fan. And one, because I'd go watch my brother play and all his buddies. But two, getting to know Coach Chamati, Coach Richards, over the years. I have a ton of respect for their program, and just the way they do things. And I think, being a fan of them, you consistently saw the last, 5 years, 6 years, them compete with these top teams. And sometimes they would beat a Virginia, they would take Maryland down to the wire. They might beat, a Duke, a UNC, and you're kind of like, wow, that was kind of like an upset. And so I think this year, the first half of the season, you're like, wow, they almost upset Cornell. Oh, wow, they came back against Maryland. Oh, they beat Virginia. Wow, it's an upset. And now you're watching, to your point, I'm watching the game with my brother. I'm like, if you take Richmond off of the jersey, right? If you took the jersey labels off both teams, off Richmond and Cornell, you're like, these two teams are the same caliber, right? They're not different than a Big Ten and ACC, a top Ivy League team. And not saying that hasn't been the case in the past, but it's they're a top 10 team, they're a top 8 team. That's not a fluke. So I think what we talked about, Coach Chamati, Coach Richards, they've done with that program is incredible. But that is a talented team, and across the board, they have really, really good players that play well, that are well coached.
It's exciting to see, and we talked a lot about it back in March, coming off some of those games. And I think, again, the big challenge for them was getting past that first round. They're not a stranger to the tournament, but getting past that first round and getting on the big stage where when everyone's tuning in most, it's quarterfinals and semis. The first round games, they go quick, and then a lot of extra fans start to tune in for quarters, semifinals, more games on ESPN, and more people got to see the brand of Richmond lacrosse. And a lot of credit to Coach Chamati with where they got to, and would have been awesome to see them in the Final Four. But he's really steered that program in an incredible direction.
Obviously, I think a lot of what you're talking about might be towards the recruiting standpoint too, right? And everyone gets eyes on the Richmond program. And I think what also stands out, talk about Richmond's body language, they were acting like they should be there, right? When they scored a goal, it wasn't oh my God, we just, we're in this, we're competing with Cornell. It was this is how it's kind of supposed to be, which I thought was, interesting to see, but also really fun to watch. So that was a great game. The one after it, Syracuse beating Princeton 19-18, probably one of the better games. I don't know if you guys caught the whole thing, but probably one of the better games I've ever seen. Just live, but just swings back and forth. Not a ton of defense was played. Obviously super high scoring, but definitely was entertaining for the fans. So I don't know if you guys have any takes or comments on that one.
I didn't catch that one live. I rewatched a lot of the highlights and was looking through the box score and reading up on it. Both goalies were at 40% on both teams. I think Princeton's slightly won the face-off edge. Palumbo 6-2, Spallina 4-4. And guys, we were kind of mentioning this before the podcast. I guess, Stephen being a Syracuse alum, Spallina gets interviewed after the game. And he had a great game. Like he's a really good player, right? But I think voiced some frustrations on the criticism he's gotten about not being able to, score off the dodge. And Syracuse posted a social media graphic. Stephen, you want to run us through what that graphic was?
No, that's all right. I think you're setting me up a little bit. Yeah, basically, Spallina had some comments. I guess it'd be hard for him. The kid's been in the media since he was 12 years old. His family's involved in lacrosse. He's definitely been getting chirped that he can't beat guys. And I think he's evolved this year into just the player that he is. I thought he did a really good job, on his just 1v1 dodging to start the game, right? Scores 4 goals in a row. A lot of what he was alluding to after the game was like, oh, I thought I can dodge. So, it's heat of the moment, right? He's pumped up that they won. It definitely is some ammo for Maryland and whoever ends up guarding him, right? And Maryland's defense is, extremely strong. And there's still a lot of games left to play, right? Like, making the Final Four is awesome for Syracuse. There's no doubt about it, right? You can't take that away. It's a program that used to be there all the time, but hasn't been there since 2013. Like, that's a long time. So, nice for alums and for the team and for fans to have them back. But this weekend's a whole different ballgame. Like no one really necessarily remembers who was in the Final Four. Like you're going to remember who won. So I just think that's important to remember and, time to reset, which, hopefully they are. And I think you talk about it, but it's rematches this weekend, right? Maryland, talk about a team you cannot take for granted. And, I assumed that Maryland was going to make the Final Four just like they almost do every year.
I think you get to a level with a lot of these programs where getting to the Final Four is the expectation. And, teams being back, or another program that it comes up a lot with is Hopkins. It's almost like a running commentary. If Hopkins wins their first 5 or 6 games or they beat UNC early, everywhere is plastered. Is Hopkins back? Is this the year? And I think the hard part about that, just in terms of expectations, is when they get back to the Final Four or, a Cuse gets back to the Final Four, if you lose that game, you don't really feel that much better when it's all said and done, because that's really not the bar that's been set, at those programs. And I think when you're at any of these programs that are consistently in the mix, you really don't feel good unless you're the one hoisting the trophy at the end of the season. And it's really hard to win a championship. And it's, I think all 4 teams, if you're looking at this season, Penn State, they got robbed a couple of years ago. Cornell, it's their dream team. Maryland is trying to win after losing last year against Notre Dame. And Cuse is finally here with a lot of expectations around the junior and senior class. So I think there's a lot of pressure on every team. And all 3 that don't win are going to feel very upset that they're not the ones holding the trophy. And it's probably hard to look at the season like a success.
I do think there's a level, right? And I totally agree because from a guy that's gotten there and lost many times in a program that has, it's like on one hand, look at Coach Tillman, has won 2 championships, has been to, 10 Final Fours, if that's right, I'm not even positive, and 8 championship games and won 2 of them. So like on paper, 2 out of 8, not great, but getting there is like not nothing. These teams, it's obviously not their end objective. And to your point, both of you, Deemer and Stephen, they're not going to be happy if they lose. But I do think there's a difference in like people will talk like, when's the last time, Cuse got to a Final Four? That is like a thing for a program benchmark. So I think all of these teams, it's a big deal. But it's not like when you say a team's back, it's not like just because they're good, you get to go to Final Fours. Like Maryland just gets to go to a Final Four. It's not like it's really hard. Like it's a hard journey, and you guys know this. But like mid-season games, like losing in conference, playing against a top schedule, you have to be good enough to get into the tournament, which is no easy feat. Then you get in, like most of these teams have to win a competitive first round game. the quarterfinals never a cakewalk, as we saw this past week. And now the Final Four, like everybody is good. And it's such a challenge. And so I do think, like to your guys' point, people remember the teams that won, but I think for all of these programs, like getting to the Final Four is no easy feat. And I hope they at least enjoy, being there, because it's a really special experience.
That's where it all comes back to, like, the perspective. Everyone's in different shoes when it comes to these discussions. Like when I look at like Spallina and post game, like at the same time, like what he's gone through and the hate and the negative media attention that he's had to deal with. Steve, I remember we were talking earlier this year on the podcast. I don't know if it was coming to his defense, but like really pointing out all the great things he's done as a player. And then on one hand, hey, like he's finally a part of that as a junior, getting that team back to the Final Four. So that is huge, and if he lets some steam out, he knows better than anyone that he's going to have to bring it next game regardless, because he's always getting every, defensive game plan and matchup. So it kind of brings me to like just the idea of the man in the arena, and if you've got some of that swagger to you, you kind of need that, you need to have that self-belief and confidence, and you can spin it in a lot of different ways, but at the same time, like, hey, he's bringing that edge right into the semis.
I think you guys are spot on with all of it. Spallina, he's a guy, he's obviously been through a lot. He's had a target on his back his whole life, but obviously wearing 22 there, big on social media, just, has all eyes on him. In terms of like being back, if Syracuse loses to Maryland this weekend, it's going to be like, the Syracuse lacrosse boards are going to be like, fire Gary. He can't win the big one. He can't do this, right? It's like just the day and age that we live in. And I think, like I said, everything that you guys are saying is spot on. Two guys I did want to just shout out from this game, Chad Palumbo and Peter, is it Bonanno from Princeton? I mean, like superstar type. Pete Bonanno, like that guy, I think he was 3-3. Just some of the goals he was scoring, like playing like that as a freshman in the quarterfinal, I just was like, wow. And then, Palumbo, he's a guy, I'm pretty sure that he battled and beat cancer back in high school. But he has, an incredible high school highlight tape for any kids that want to go check that out. And I think it was a question of like, can he play like this in college? And he can. Like he had a couple behind the back passes, a couple backhands. I think he finished the game 6-2. He was a star and was like a star down the stretch. So, that was a really great game. A lot of great plays, a lot of great players, and guys that we'll also get to continue to watch in college. Flipping over to Sunday, Penn State, Notre Dame. Penn State wins this game 14-12. They were down 12-6. So Notre Dame's up 12-6 with, I think it ended up being 4 minutes left in the third quarter. I've gone back and watched that last like quarter and a half. Would love your guys' kind of takes on it. Matt, I know you're going to have some insight on like Penn State defensively, but I guess my early thoughts would just be like, what a comeback, like that resilience under that pressure against the two-time defending champs. Penn State did not look good early. They couldn't do much on offense. We'll talk about Matt Trainer a little bit, but Don, would love any of your comments, especially on that Penn State defense.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching the game with some people, and I was in a group text, and like first half, people like it was like this game's over, and man, I can't believe Penn State's even in the quarterfinal. Like, and that's just, we're all idiots, we talk about recency bias. Like you watch like 5 minutes lacrosse, the team doesn't play well, and you're just like, this offense stinks. And then 3 times throughout the game that changed. There was runs. I think like, we just posted on social media about Penn State zone. So if anybody watched the game or if you didn't, basically Penn State's used zone throughout the year kind of strategically. They play a lot of man defense, but they have a back pocket zone and they're not afraid to use it. In the second quarter, they were down maybe 6-3 and they went zone and Notre Dame scored. So they kind of bailed on the zone. Notre Dame went up, the score got to 12-6. In the third quarter, Penn State goes back to zone, goes on an 8-0 run and wins 14-12. And I do think, like, obviously not that the zone's perfect, and there's other elements to that too. I think the momentum of the game really just switched there, but I think the zone was a big part of it. They were struggling against Notre Dame's man-to-man offense. And if nothing else, it just like, and you guys could probably speak to this as offensive players, like sometimes you just get in a rhythm against a man offense or a man defense, and then the zone can kind of just break the rhythm. The play doesn't initiate the same way. There's a little bit of like guys, the defense is like clogging up weird spots, and like the slides that your reads are different because the slide's not from the crease. Penn State kind of had a short stick on the crease, locked the crease, 5-man rotation around it. and kind of just forced low angle shots, further out shots. They were able to contest most of the shots, give up shots the goalies want to see. The zone also afforded them. Like, the interesting thing about zone is like, you sometimes have a guy that's able to run out shots better. So when Notre Dame missed a shot, Penn State ran 2 or 3 of them out and got the turnover because they had a guy back there. And so I just think, and the announcers were talking throughout the game too, like, Notre Dame doesn't really have like a stretch shooter, like an elite stretch shooter. So when you play zone, you might give up some of those in the gaps shots, but like, you're getting a stick on them. And to me, it's just like, Notre Dame got some shots off, but like, it disrupted their rhythm. And then Penn State's offense, which I'm sure you guys could talk more about, like, it seemed like they really got going. And like, trainer Lehman had some really impressive takes. He's a guy we've talked about this year that I really like his game. So kind of like a tale of two halves, but I do think that zone kind of helped, but the whole momentum of the game flipped around that point.
Everything you said is spot on. And I would say too, like, it's so interesting where when you get into the tournament, these games really become games of runs. And I think that's the exciting thing. And so when you change something up and then you get hot, it's 12-6, and effectively Penn State gets hot on offense. They finish the third quarter 6 for 9 shooting, and then that comes at the same time, to your point, Matt, of causing some low angle shots and some turnovers in the zone. And now a 6-goal game becomes a 3-goal game to start the fourth. Penn State's winning faceoffs, and now it's a ball game. I actually had a terrible call last week. I thought like Will Lynch, him and just everything that Notre Dame had going. I didn't think it was going to be this close of a game, and I definitely wouldn't have anticipated relinquishing such a big lead. But that's where I think these games are so exciting. And again, back to even the idea around Richmond, it's exciting to see some new blood, some new teams break through and, create a lot of Made Madness.
Deemer, question for you, just on the topic of like, NCAA games going on runs. I believe it was your freshman year, your guys' national championship game against Syracuse. I think you were down, correct me if I'm wrong, 5 at half. Can you talk a little bit about what that game was like in terms of runs? Or you went down 5-0 to start. Obviously, Fowler was amazing at the faceoff X, but can you talk about what that, felt like, just, continuing to get the ball and whatnot?
Yeah. We were down 5-0 and everything was working for Syracuse. And it just felt like, wow, like, is this really happening? Like, is this how the game started? And I vividly remember like Coach Danowski called a timeout. And I think this was where, again, his genius and, mindset around like reading the guys and trying to, inspire and figure out what was needed. That's where he like opened up in the huddle about just like having fun and like letting go of the pressure. And then we settled in, and Fowler, I think, went 23 or 22 of 25 the rest of the game at the faceoff X. And then like the seniors and juniors led the way. It was an amazing like comeback, but just game of runs. And then there wasn't any doubt once we got a couple on the board. So it's crazy how that stuff can move. And that's where I think, again, it's about different guys stepping up and, different plays to be made. And then it's hard at that point, I think, to like scheme and, get people out of it, because it becomes so much more than just X's and O's.
I think just quickly watching the Penn State, like the last 3 minutes of that third quarter and then the fourth quarter, one thing that I love from like their offense, one, they were playing with some pace, like just even in the sub game, right? Not wasting like 10 to 12 seconds, like jogging onto the field, which I think a lot of teams can do. But they weren't settling, like they're down 6 and you're down 4, but they're not settling for like their first look, right, of like a rush. And I think their shot selection down the stretch too, like it obviously everything has to go right. You're down 6 with not a lot of time left, but like offensively, their execution, right? All right, do I want to take this shot down the alley, stick to the outside, a little bit of a low angle, or should we just move it forward? 25 seconds left on the shot clock. Let's work for another one. Like the composure that takes, the confidence that takes, and just like the mental focus, but also mental toughness. I just, obviously found super impressive.
I think Deemer said, I think, that Coach D story is really cool. I mean, managing the runs like is a huge part of, I think, being a coach and being a great team. And like, you go to those Final Four games, like, I'll tell you, anxiety and nerves are like through the roof going into this weekend, not just from the players, but the coaches too. And so these coaches that can kind of, to your point, Deemer, read the guys, like sometimes a team needs a coach to get on them. Sometimes the team needs the coach to like, hey, we're good. Like smile, have fun. Like we're playing lacrosse. We love doing this, right? And I think that's like an art to the art of coaching, which is why it's like challenging. And some guys are so great at it, is like they're good at X's and O's, all X's and O's, all these things, recruiting, whatever. But they also can really read at that pulse. And you can almost guarantee that throughout the Final Four, there's going to be runs. Like I'm sure like these coaches are preparing their teams like, hey, let's not be delusional. Like expect to be down 5-0. Like we don't want to be, but like, hey, it might happen. Guess what? Like we're gonna, those are the runs of the game. And I think these teams, you kind of see it, like the Penn State game, you're just watching it. Like in the beginning of the game, you're like, any shot Penn State takes just like not really going to go in. You're like, they keep missing wide, they keep hitting pipes, the goalie keeps saving it. And Notre Dame was kind of the opposite. In the second half, like every shot Penn State was taking was like, you see them shooting like the net moves. And you look at like some of these takes, and we were talking earlier, but Trainer, like I am so impressed by him. He's a guy that to me gets like the absolute most out of what he has, right? Like he's really skilled. So I'm not trying to say he doesn't have a lot, but he's had a great season. He's obviously a first round PLL draft pick. And he's like, not like this most dynamic athlete you're talking about, like with some of these other guys that pop off the page, but he's so effective and like really just like makes plays. And we were talking about that diving goal. He had the backhand, which is an insane play right in itself. But like the more impressive thing to me was the start of that. Stephen, we were talking earlier, he runs a flyby, teammate throws it to him. He's like kind of covered. The Notre Dame pole starts whacking his arms. Like he could have turned that over, but he picks it up. A slide comes, he manages to slide, kind of like redodges it, keeps going and dives and scores. Like that play could have been a turnover on the flyby and could have been Notre Dame ball going the other way and turns into this huge momentum goal. You score that and you're like, things are kind of like you kind of get some momentum and swagger there. And just a guy to have the poise to handle that ball and to make that play. Like there's moments like that in that game where, Lehman scores one and you're like, wow, that was like maybe a right-handed shot. And you're like, that is like the ball's just going in for them.
Do you think Sean Light should have covered Trainer? I was surprised at that. That's what I assumed.
I always am careful with this stuff because like these coaches know it better than I do. They know their guys. They scout the hell out of it. I was in like a few like group text with guys and that it was like, why is Light not covering Trainer? I don't know the answer. I kind of would have thought like at some point maybe that switch would have happened because I do think Sean Light's one of, if not the best cover guy in college lacrosse right now. He's he's very, very good at it. And Trainer is, maybe not the guy you initially would think needs to be the number one matchup, depending on who you have. But like throughout the game, the way it got going, I was a little surprised.
I don't know a ton about defense. I was surprised. I think what Trainer also did so well, one, he's been like a guy on our notable performances that I go through each week. Like he's definitely been a regular staple. Like he's had a good year. He's scored 7 goals against Hopkins, 5 against Princeton, 6 this past weekend against Notre Dame. So he's a guy that's like, he's a star. But in this game, like he just continued to get like, what do you call it? Like in the paint, like he was finishing in front. Like I was so impressed with just kind of the grit that he was showing, whether he took it underneath, right? And almost had more of like an S dodge or coming over the top and just like tucking it and, just fighting through some of those checks. Like he genuinely was putting the team on his back. And at some point the announcers were like, this is like a man amongst boys, which it was.
Well, how about like to me, the sign of like one of the moments with him, he gets switched onto a short stick and kind of ends up in a quick invert and like just takes top side and just like snaps it quickly and scores before the shot goes in. Like, yeah, good player gets a shorty. Like, yeah, they're going to ISO. But like sometimes in that, they kind of force a shot. It doesn't. And like he had that one, like when he got a sliver of a chance, he converted. Like he capitalized right away and was just like efficient and on.
He only had one turnover, one caused turnover. So almost wiped him out too.
He has, in my opinion, with the possibility of Penn State winning the championship, I think he could go down as the all-time great Penn State player, which I think is an interesting discussion. And obviously, guys like Ament and Malone and O'Keefe, have been a part of laying that groundwork. But I think when you lift your team like he has and possibly, has a chance to cement his legacy, that would be all time.
I think it gets hard with O'Keefe having like getting the goal record and all that, but like I see what you're saying. I mean,
it does, but at the same time, I think a lot of people also take credit away from him because of Grant's role in that. I think it's, when I look around like the Penn State offense, like you've got Aquino, who's had a fantastic freshman year, and you've had Layman like really improve as a slasher, at like Matthews, right? He's had good numbers, but not like elite Canadian numbers either. So he is the focal point, of the game prep. And he like, just like you said, Steve, is continuing to deliver in all different kinds of ways. Some of the plays kind of remind me of Dan Buccaro. Like when he got hot for Georgetown, they were like these wiry types of goals that were just like electric.
That might be, for my money, one of the greatest playoff performances
That was incredible.
performances I've ever seen. Against Chris Fake, who's a really good defender. And that was really impressive. And, I wouldn't maybe put this at the exact same, but Trainer's like 6-1 here. Some of his goals, like the way he scored them, to your guys' point, in like the run like this, it's up there for like single-handed playoff performances to win a big game.
He's a star. I think even just quickly, Mac O'Keefe, everyone always thought he was like the number 2 behind the men. I am a firm believer they're like 1A, 1B. I think he is like even better than advertised. This was a great game. Moving on to the next one. I candidly did not catch a ton of this one, the Georgetown, Maryland one. This is also the game that everyone was kind of saying was like the sleeper of the weekend because it wasn't a 1 goal, like, either massive comeback or super exciting at the end. But I think just like a classic Maryland finding the best way to, stop the other team, make sure that they're scoring their goals, like, just executed perfectly. Tillman continues to be like the gold standard, in college lacrosse coaching. So would love, I don't know, Matt, if I'm putting you on the spot, Maryland alum, but any thoughts on this?
I mean, one, how classic is this? How it turned out as it was supposed to, right? Like versus the Princeton Syracuse, like 18-19 or whatever, then 9-6. Like everybody, when you kind of like, oh, this will be a low scoring game, like the way these teams play, but then randomly it's like 14-12, and you're like, oh, I guess I was wrong. Like this was the game everybody thought it would be. I mean, look, both teams, like we talked about it before. Coach Warren and Coach Tillman are very close. They coached together at Harvard. They coached together at Maryland. Then Coach Warren took the Georgetown job. Both are great coaches. Both, like Jesse Bernhardt at Maryland played for Coach Warren. They're very tight, and like there's a whole line of like connections between these programs. Mike Phipps, the offensive coordinator at Maryland, coached at Georgetown. So like there's a lot of connections there. It was like a big, like the comments after the game were Maryland players and Coach Till's talking about it feeling like a Big Ten game, right? Like it was like, I think you look at these like ACC and Ivy League are kind of like a more aside from Duke, a more like offensive oriented league this year. And the Big East to a degree and the Big Ten were like a very like thumper, heavier, defensive, like physical league. And I think that's what you saw in this game. And I mean, honestly, it kind of was what we thought it would be. Maryland played good defense. Georgetown played good defense. There was a number of like transition goals and things along those lines, but by no means a shootout. And I don't have much else there other than kind of just like, Logan was 65% in the cage. Like this is how Maryland wins games. They're probably like, if the Syracuse game, and we'll talk about that a little next week, is like a 15-14 game, like it's probably not in Maryland's favor. Like they won the last game 11-7. There's like a stat where, and this, every time Maryland gets to 10 goals, like they've won 90-something% of their games in the last however many years. And that's like kind of the way they play, like keep teams under 10. They can usually get to like 9 or 10 or 11, but that's kind of like the bread and butter of like what they're set up to do. And Georgetown's pretty similar, aside from obviously the Duke game was a little random there.
We'll even look at Aiden Carroll's, performance. Like he's had an awesome year. This is no slight at him. He's been scoring, a ton of goals, especially down the stretch. The one that stands out, he was 2-1, 2 for 9 shooting. Like we had talked about a little bit, Matt, I think maybe like off camera, right? Maryland's going to be ready for that. Like they are going to, scout every single piece of his game, force him into looks that he doesn't like. So that stood off the page to me, with Georgetown also only being able to score 6 goals.
I'll say, like, everybody gives Coach Tillman a lot of credit, and he deserves it. Like Jesse Bernhardt, and like he with his like defensive game planning. And remember, Maryland didn't really have, and none of those guys were supposed to be All-Americans. They graduated Ajax, they graduated Weirman at the face-off, and obviously Logan's great. Like I think the thing he does best, like one, he fundamentally trains the kids throughout the year. You watch them play, like their fundamentals are incredible defensively and as a unit, but their game plans, like they will not let a team beat you with that team strengths. They're going to watch the tape and be like, this is what these guys do. Like, they're going to beat us. They're going to beat us doing something else. And so it's not going to be like Aiden Carroll. Like, I'm sure all week they probably had a guy in like a red penny that was Aiden Carroll, and like they were just like all over the way they were playing that, and Syracuse gets a little more challenging, but I thought they game planned really well last game for how they supported Selena, and each player kind of had their own like game plan oriented. Where do you force this guy? When do you slide to this guy? Like, what is this? Is he a shooter feeder? Can he shoot sweeping? Can he shoot under? And I think what Jesse does there is like, maybe gets a little underappreciated because of the success Coach Tillis has had, and just people assume Maryland's good at defense. But I mean, I'm so impressed watching that unit each week.
One thing I'll be curious, and we'll talk about it more in like just the game preview. When I think of that, and then when I think of like the Cuse game, I just can't help but think how important guys like Anderson, Fadl, and Michael Leo will be to Cuse having offensive success, because I just don't think it's going to be the known attack commodities putting up all these points. I think it's going to be these really gritty possessions. Like, even watching the first quarter of the Maryland game, both Maryland's goals are in transition in the first quarter. Back and forth, the possessions were just grind them out, physical, heavy contact, banging bodies just to get like a clean shot. And then like goalies were great, So it's going to be very interesting to see. And I do agree with the point around the pace. A slower game, I think, is going to allow it to be a really grind them down game, and probably favors Maryland in that. If Cuse can get the momentum going early and run, I think that's when they're going to be at their best and flying around.
I guess that brings us right into, upcoming weekend. We've got Penn State versus Cornell Saturday, noon, Syracuse, Maryland, 2:30. We can hit the Syracuse, Maryland one first, just because we're already talking about it. Interesting stat. I think I said it this year back when they played. John Tillman, he's never lost to Syracuse while at Maryland. He's 7-0 against them. Syracuse's last win over Maryland was May 16th, 2009. So it's been a long time, right? Maryland has been a school that Syracuse has not been able to beat. Going into this one, just looking at the February 15th matchup, Maryland won that 11-7. I know we were just commenting on that. Face-offs were 50-50. McCool was 52% for Syracuse. McNaney was 63% for Maryland. No one was like overly. I think the most points anyone had was 4 with both Spanos and Spallina. Matt, we had talked about, and Deemer, you're alluding to it a little bit, but like Maryland just was forcing Syracuse into taking bad shots to get into areas on the field that they're like a little bit more uncomfortable offensively. Defensive clinic holding Syracuse to, definitely a season low for them at 7 goals. So this is going to be, a huge game. This is Syracuse's first time. The only one with experience in the Final Four would be Sam English, because he got it when he was at Princeton. But this Maryland team, they've all been there except for the freshman class. So, looking forward to this one. I think it's going to be an awesome game, and definitely like a heavyweight battle for sure.
Yeah. We broke down, like we did a video on Maryland's kind of defense against Cuse's offense last time. And it's like the game plan as a fan makes you a little bit uncomfortable, and I'm sure as a coach too, because you don't want to get in a slide and recovery spin cycle against Cuse. Like, you just don't want to. But they have some guys that are pretty dangerous. And so Maryland's game plan last time we talked about, part of it was relying on Logan to make some saves and kind of baiting Syracuse into taking shots that were probably just outside of what you would call a quality shot, right? Like a shot where you'd be like, I could take this shot, but it's not like a high quality shot. And so then you kind of bank that they're not just stinging them that game, right? Like Hiltz had a little bit too low of an angle. Sam English kind of top side, but a little bit outside of his range. Roa kind of guy, maybe force him to feed a little more, because he is like, I don't even have the stats in front of me, but he's not like an assist guy. The way they supported the Spallina, trusting Will Shower on that, but kind of like, knowing when he gets posted up, can you get like more of an adjacent support and see if kick it out, and maybe they didn't take like a 15-yard shot. And so I think for Cuse, the challenge is going to be one, can you win the short stick matchups to the point where Maryland has to like slide early and more consistently? Because then that's where the Cuse like ball movement is like, it's really good when they can get you to that point. And 2, maybe can they like fight the urge to take the shot Maryland's baiting them into and like attack that approach, and like try to like work deeper into the shot clock, which does work to Maryland's favor. But it is one of those games where like, look, if Cuse is like hot and stinging it, you're like, kind of tough, because you want to like slide, get out more, but you kind of challenge them to beat you in ways they don't necessarily do. You play the odds game. And so I would expect to see a similar approach to Maryland, and kind of interested to see how Cuse would like counter that.
The way that the game was last week with Princeton, like I kind of said 2 weeks ago, like I kind of thought it was going to be similar to the Ivy League title game, where both teams were run and gun and flying around. And I just think that the way that Maryland is when you get to the Final Four and how they get there, and then just, a lot of times like some of these Final Four games are a little slower paced. I just think that really puts to your point about the shot selection, like the onus of taking those good shots and really working to upgrade when you're just going to have a lot more limited number of possessions. How does the Cuse offense really, make that happen? And, those guys step up, make those decisions, find those extra passes on the inside. Like they had some good looks in the first game, but there's just going to be less chances, so, you don't really want to be rolling the dice in terms of taking 12 to 15 yard shots against a goalie like Logan.
Just being honest, as a Syracuse alum, right? Syracuse is going to have to play their most disciplined game, ever, to beat Maryland. That's just what it's going to take. Syracuse is much better in these games where it's a track meet, right? You're running up and down. Like there's turnovers on the other end. There's big plays in the middle of the field, super high scoring games. Like that's where they'll get you. It's when it's a slower pace. You're not getting the ball as much. You can't have those quick 1-and-out possessions. You take a look at the box score from the last time they played Maryland, only 5 guys on the Syracuse roster got a shot off, right? And everyone was under 33%, with the majority of everyone under 25%. So you just, going to have to be disciplined, going to have to play a really smart game, obviously in the ride and the clear, but offensively, taking good shots.
Stephen, you've called a handful of Syracuse games. You're pretty familiar with them. I know I'm asking a defensive question here. Like, does Cuse zone Maryland for a lot of this game?
I don't know if they do, because that could slow things up. Like then Maryland could take even longer possessions. And, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I think Syracuse might want to instead play man and hope to be able to muck it up a little bit more in terms of like speeding up the game, right? Taking a little bit more chances. Dearna, even watching like how they started off the Princeton game, the matchups were completely different on the third possession than the first possession, just switching things up, maybe going zone when they go behind the cage, then back into man. So I think he would rather play that game than go like strict into zone.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Really slow it down.
I bet that if I'm Maryland this week, I bet Maryland's practicing zone offense. I don't think they'll play zone the whole game, but I bet timeout, shot off an end line at some point.
Yeah, stuff like that, definitely.
Yeah.
Like
You gotta
throw it
look
in.
like, does Maryland have Maryland's going to play, they're going to work the man-to-man defense deep into the shot clock too, right? And so you mix it in. Does Maryland have a lot of rangy step down shooters?
And that's the thing. And that's where like Syracuse doesn't want to, the thing that always happens to them against like a Maryland, you get scored on with 7 seconds left on the shot clock. Right. And that's just like a killer. Like you play this great possession. So it's like, all right, figuring out how do you stop that? Right. Is that going full zone, or is that switching in and out of it? Is it, throwing different looks at them? So, and, ultimately, and this is why Maryland's so good, that's really hard to defend. Teams that can score late into the shot clock consistently, like, it kills you down. Mentally and physically, right? And it's like, all right, they just scored with 7 seconds left, and then they just won the face-off. Like they're coming down to do it again. Like that patience is very impressive. So, we'll see.
I think I'd expect some wrinkles, but both these teams probably, like if I'm Cuse coming out of last week too, I'm like, you have some momentum. We're going to play our game. We're going to, hey, this is who we are. Last time didn't really go our way. We're better now type of deal. Like, I think both these teams are going to try to lean into their identity, and it'll be pretty classic. Probably not the 5-4 2011 Maryland Cuse game. We saw that, that got the shot clock installed in,
that was at Foxborough too.
Yeah.
The quarterfinal game. I don't know why it was there. That's when Syracuse brought out those Volt jerseys, cursed them. All right, we're moving on to the first game of the weekend at Penn State versus Cornell. Another, rematch from earlier in the year. This is Cornell's only loss to the season against Penn State. Since Tambroni left Cornell for Penn State, he has been 6-3 against Cornell. On March 8th, Penn State won 13-12. Wild game, major comeback at the end. Aquino was 1-4 that game. Trainer and Lehman, they did not play for Penn State, so they were missing, their best player. So, really looking forward to this one as well. I think it's been a matchup that we've seen kind of throughout the years. And I guess interesting again that it gets to be, a rematch.
my thought too with this, and Matt, you did a great breakdown on Penn State zone. I think Cornell matches up extremely well against the zone. So I'll be really curious. Like, I think again, like that's what to me makes Cornell so deadly is that their attack unit, again, even referencing our podcast with Mike and CJ, they're so bought in to getting the best shot and they're so unselfish. They have great vision that I think they can pick apart a zone. And so it will just be interesting, even just to see how does it go from a game flow perspective? How do they game plan and support some of the top matchups? How does Cornell, just facilitate, good offense? And probably at this point, honestly, like if you're just going against a man-to-man, like you're probably not going to throw too many wrinkles from what you really do. Do the simple things really well, trust your horses, make Penn State rotate, and then make great decisions. I think really, I think Frassion's a strong goalie, but he's also one that if you get into him early, like, you could open up the floodgates. If you let him get hot, and slow things down too, then that's where, it's going to be, I think, a tight game. So it's, I think it's going to be a great matchup.
Yeah, one of the interesting stats from the Richmond Cornell game was Wyatt Nust, the goalie for Cornell, saved the ball at 29%. And so you look at a game that close, and there's a number of things that play in the goalie save percentage. You guys know, like what kind of shots is the opponent getting? Like if a defense is playing really well, it helps the goalie see shots they want to see, higher save percentage, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be a big piece here. I also think one thing that makes Cornell so tough, and I think is what makes CJ Kurse so great. He kind of like what the Kavanaughs have done over the years is like he was not on this past weekend. He was not like he had 4 points, but he shot like 15%. But he was riding the ball back, playing hard. And so like when you have a team like that, even Penn State goes zone, but then you turn it over, you have an attack bin that's going to like ride the heck out of you, get a turnover. Like it's no easy day. I would expect Penn State to, probably mix man and zone. And if zone's going well, they'll stick with it. If it's not, they'll probably go back to man. The one thing I'll say is like, and this is also a question for you guys, like, is Kelleher a stretch shooter? Like, who does Cornell have that can really step in from 15 and you're like, man, I don't want to give that shot up?
Yeah, I think he definitely is. I also think though, from like a zone offense perspective, I don't even think they necessarily would have to have guys that can like stretch it so well as much as just like really high IQ guys from like a ball movement perspective to not have to be a stretch shooter, right? To not have to shoot from 15, but to get a shot from like 8 to 10, between Goldstein, between Willem Firth, like talk about a guy that can play against his zone. Kurse, Michael Long, like they're pretty equipped to do it.
Yeah, I'll say like as a zone, and this could, this is part of the reason a coach you're like a little bit hesitant to go zone. Like you go zone, offenses usually hate when teams go zone, but like as a defensive coach, why don't more teams do it? You kind of lose role clarity a little bit, in my opinion, because like you're kind of sharing guys. There's like these weird moments. But one thing you can do if you're not afraid of getting stretched out is you really overemphasize like stacking the inside, because in the zone, you do have a guy that's the Penn State zone has a guy that's fully not part of the rotation. He's ball side inside. If you watch their bases play, the base that's not covering the ball flips his hips and gets his chest inside. So if there's only one guy at X, there's 2 guys inside now. And so where's the opportunity? If I'm Penn State scouting, it's like, hey, like we're willing to give up those 12 yarders, and like maybe Cornell scores, but also maybe it's like, once again, out of the rhythm that Cornell would like want to get to of like the 10 and in. So it's kind of like the counter argument there. And look, Cornell could totally shred the zone, but also it could be like Cornell's getting a bunch of shots from 12 and 13 yards. And they're kind of like Penn State's getting like a stick on the, like a stick to the glove or a stick on the stick head as they shoot, and the ball spraying. And it's like one of those like tough to get into rhythm games versus like letting somebody, Goldstein, dodge or get an invert, and Kurse kind of does that weird turn cut on the inside. And like, there's guys not sure if they should switch it, and somebody's trying to slide. And so, I can see it. I've been wrong too many times to know for sure what's going to happen, but like probably some Penn State logic there too, is like, hey, we're going to give out some outside shots in the zone. Like we're going to stop Cornell's offense. Like, let's just choose where they're going to shoot from.
I wonder with that, I think when you're like talking about their top six, I don't agree that like Long could be a guy from like 15, but do I think he could be a guy from 12 to 13 for sure? And then when I think you put Kelleher and Kirst up there, I think you just get really nervous about all those guys to where when they start stepping in gaps, I think they just force those rotations. And I think Kirst has range, So it's like I get that. And then I just wonder, like, even as a defender in the moment, how much can you stick to that game plan before they start really getting you rotating, wind up, really sell it, and then they're dumping it adjacent or inside, So it would be such a good battle to see, and then who's going to have that discipline to stick to their scheme when those possessions, drag out.
Zone offense and I think we've talked about it, but just like very interesting from as much as you practice it and then like the body language of the zone. Like if Penn State goes into zone, is Cornell going to get flustered? Or are they like, yeah, we've been practicing this all year. Like we're ready for it regardless. Like I think that comes down to a lot. And then that's like, just team by team. Do people practice zone offense every single week or only when they might face it? I like at Syracuse, just anecdotally, we would practice zone offense every single Thursday or maybe every single Wednesday from the fall until the spring. So like whenever we saw it, it was like, oh, let's go. Like we love playing zone. Right. But if you're not doing that on a weekly basis, then I think that you can get to some of these games and that suddenly you're flustered.
I think Penn State will use it. The good thing about Penn State is that they've used it enough that it's not like a weird thing for them to do. And so now they've normalized it being a tool they have. So it's not like panic mode when they go zone. It's like, hey, they'll probably start off in man and they give up 2 goals or they don't. And they'll be like, hey, second quarter, we're starting in zone just to like, hey, or like off this end line, we're going to zone, or we're starting in zone. And then we screw, 2 will go to man, but we're not done with zone. Maybe we'll come back in the third. And it's like a tactic just to like see if they can if Cornell ever gets in a rhythm to just like try to, hey, can we like just change up what they're doing? Which is like a nice tool to have in your back pocket. Cornell, interestingly, not really a zone team all that much, went zone against Richmond at the end of the game. That was like, to me, you're watching, there's a timeout. Richmond has a chance to score. They're drawing up a play. And you're like, it seems like a good time to go zone because it can kind of mess up a play that somebody draws and kill clock. But you're like, they haven't played zone all game. So did they do it? And they did. And honestly, great call. But it's interesting to see like them use it that way in like a very strategic flash instance versus Penn State kind of defaulting as like an identity.
Really looking forward to, the men's matchups this weekend. I think whatever game we end up getting on Monday is going to be another great game. So best of luck to all those men's teams. Flipping the script just quickly here to the women's side for a bit. These games are also at Foxborough. So we got one venue for everything this weekend, which is pretty awesome. Women's semifinals, they start on Friday. The final will be Sunday at noon. Friday, 3 p.m. first game, UNC versus Florida. And then 5:30 p.m. BC versus Northwestern. So more rematches from the beginning of the season. We'll go UNC Florida first. UNC undefeated heading into this back on February 15th. So very early season. UNC 14, Florida 9. The Humphrey sisters combined for, I believe, 14 points in that first game. We had them on the podcast last week if people want to go and check it out. But Deemer would love any, thoughts that you have about this one.
Hopefully we'll have been able to get out a preview of both of these matchups, but I'll just touch on a couple of things that were coming to mind. When I watched Florida Duke last week, I was just really impressed with the athleticism and physicality of Florida's 1v1 defense. It really stood out. They took some fouls along with it, but that's the kind of physicality that's going to be needed to knock UNC out of their rhythm. And I think they have the athletes to do that. I think they also match up well in the middle of the field, in transition wise. They can push, they play at that high tempo. And that's something that UNC is really strong at. Really, UNC is deep at the midfield. Freshman Kate Levy, Eliza Osborne, Sophie Student, they're great on the draw circle in earning possessions, which was huge down the stretch in the ACC finals. So I think those are going to be really good matchups between the two. And then I think on offense for Florida, it's going to be interesting to see what UNC's defensive strategy. If you look at a Boston College, if you do face guard, they obviously still have other weapons, but they've got like their big three at attack. Florida, again, has some midi threats off the dodge. Franny Hahn's one of the best feeders in the country, and Clark Hamilton, one of the top freshmen in the country, but also top dodgers. So how does she handle this matchup as a freshman and Franny, a redshirt freshman? Do they implement any face guard? And I'm just going to be curious if they're going to have the depth to win enough matchups to keep pace with Carolina's high scoring, because that's kind of how I see some of these games going, where teams can get to 7 or 8, but if it turns into getting to 13, 14, 15, a team like UNC, a team like BC, they just have the firepower to keep coming at you. And if Florida doesn't can some shots early and score some transition and make some stops, that's where a game can get away from you.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. 2 things from that. I think from speaking about just Florida, like only 2 losses on the season. That early season loss to Carolina, still a pretty close game, and then they lose by 1 goal to JMU. But what I like about Florida right now, just heading into this game, is that they have been pretty battle tested. They beat a good Stanford team in overtime. I got the chance to watch that game. Like, Stanford is as physical as it gets, right? Florida, athletic team. The Duke game ended up being closer than, I thought it was going to be early on. Duke had a nice little comeback, but, they get out of there with the win. I think when I take a look at Florida too, they're back in the Final Four from last year. So they do have that experience, right? This isn't like the first time, notoriously one of the more athletic teams. So looking forward to that. And then the other piece of what you're saying, like, yeah, these teams can get to 7, 8, and 9. That brings me to kind of the next game, the BC Northwestern game. Watching BC in the quarterfinals against Yale, it was like, oh, is Yale in this game? Like, all right, they're looking like they're pretty legit. They can score goals. They're getting to that, 7. I don't even know exactly what the score was, but in that second quarter, it was like, oh, this is a good game, right? But then BC, they just keep going and going and going, right? The depth really stands out, especially in tournament time when the ante's just, up that much more. So looking forward to that one. Just a quick preview on that. They played back on February 15th as well. So same day that UNC and Florida played. BC won that game 13-9. BC's stars were somewhat limited in that game, just from like, you weren't seeing Rachel Clark, McKenna Davis, Lapinto have like incredible points. Madison Taylor for Northwestern. She was 3-3 that day, just continuing to put up, incredible numbers. But looking forward to that one. That's like another, tough physical athletic matchup. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, one thing I keep coming back to, when you go back and watch the film of that game, anyone that is curious to watch, Northwestern, I'm pretty sure, played exclusively man-to-man. I thought that was a very intentional, from an outsider's view, strategic move to not give Boston College any footage and ability to go back and get another set of reps against their high-pressure backer. Since then, Northwestern's been all high-pressure backer. They cause a lot of turnovers. Sammy White, Jane Hansen, you got Delaney Schweitzer holding it down in the cage, and Sam Smith is really fantastic, winning a lot of self-draws. So they earn a lot of possessions, and I don't think BC's as strong at the circle. I think Northwestern's supporting cast has grown to really support and help feed Madison Taylor, who has just had a phenomenal season. I thought where Yale came up short was Shea Baker, BC's top cover girl, was actually covering Jenna Collignon, who is their top scorer. But I think Fallon Vaughn is a more explosive, electric dodger, and she was in the face guard. So she got worn down in the midfield, and then, BC would rotate out of that. I'll be curious how BC game plans and handles the Taylor matchup. But it's just going to be interesting to see. And there's just, again, there's going to be so much here where, again, like the game planning, what's going on, the adjustments that are made. These teams are so familiar with each other down the stretch. It's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, rematch of last year's national championship game. Looked like Northwestern was running away with that one. I think they were up 5 or 6 goals. BC ends up winning. Speaking of like a high pressure zone, I'm not sure if it's the exact defense, how similar it is, but something that stood out just because we talk about it a lot. Yale kind of had more of a high pressure zone, especially when the ball was like behind. And I, wanted to shout out McKenna Davis. We've had her on the podcast before. She was just attacking kind of that first pressure, and it was then opening up some feeding lanes first. So instead of like retreating from it, right, and either getting doubled or moving it quickly, she wasn't afraid to kind of attack it. So I do think BC, obviously well positioned. The last thing I wanted to talk about just with this weekend, and we haven't talked about it a ton there, but The men's side, the Wharton race, like CJ Curses, he's going to win it regardless of what happens, right? And it's kind of been like, all right, who are the other four that are going to fill it? Not to take anything away from those four, but I think this has been the first year where it's like you're not kind of omitting people to get to your top five. On the women's side, we're seeing like generational runs, right, from these players. You've got Madison Taylor, phenom for Northwestern, the Humphrey sisters for UNC on offense, Rachel Clark, just setting records for BC, beat Charlotte North's single season goals record. And then Shea Dolce, right? Probably one of the best goalies we've seen. And she was an absolute game changer in the national championship game last year. So just wanted to hear, any thoughts that you have surrounding that and those five and like how much talent we have in the women's game. And they're all playing this weekend.
The talent is insane. And it's a really fun time to be a women's lacrosse fan. And I hope that the players that are up and coming are taking advantage of what they're getting to watch. It's really special. I did a training for Skywalkers in Baltimore on Tuesday night. And that was one of the things I was just sharing with the girls in terms of watching the film and studying these players. It's such an amazing time to be a fan. I truly think this is a race that can really be determined by Final Four weekend. Just because of how I think neck and neck it is and kind of different styles, different roles. I will say, I think Madison Taylor has an advantage being the one player from the three teams that's in it by herself. I think she is single-handedly, for the most part, lifting that offense and having such an incredible season where, again, not taking anything away from the Humphrey sisters or Rachel Clark. But I think for BC, you have 3 first-team All-American caliber attackers. And then for UNC, you have 2 first-team All-American caliber attackers and 5 other offensive threats that are basically top 10 recruits in all conference. And if they were all on their own teams, they would be, third team or honorable mention. And again, I don't think you should decide the award like that, but that's just why I think right now, I think Taylor has an edge. And then if someone stands on their head, in Final Four weekend, I think that could tip the scales.
Madison Taylor has 105 goals, 41 assists, 146 points on the season. That is insane, right? Those numbers. So
is that 8 points a game? What is she at for points a game? 146 divided by 18 or something like that, like 7 points a game.
They played 20 games.
7.3 points a game, and she's been fantastic. I went to the Michigan Northwestern game. My sister plays on Michigan, so it was tough to see the season end. But stepping back and having some perspective, seeing a 10-goal performance in an NCAA tournament game was,
on 11
pretty legendary.
Yeah, on 11 shots, 91%. A lot to look forward to on the women's side. I think it's going to be a great weekend. The women's Final Four has, I think, really improved in the last 10 years, just with there's no longer BC has been there, every year for the last 7 years, but they've won it twice, right? So a lot of parity once you get into that top 3, top 4. So looking forward to that. But I'll let you guys close it out if you've got any finishing thoughts.
One thing I wanted to say, I wanted to loop you in here, Matt. Last Sunday, we posted another edition of our Coach's Corner. 2 weeks ago, we wrote a piece about using the mirror from an offensive perspective. And then this past week, Matt wrote about defensive slide packages from the mirror. And I actually, had a few women's coaches bring that up to me, say that they read it, loved it. Matt, when you watched just some of those women's clips and then you just think about the writing that you did overall, men's game and just the mirror in general, was there anything that stands out to you worth sharing or mentioning quick, for people that might go read this after?
Generally, and what we say, people have different words for it, but the mirror, basically, you watch men's lacrosse, women's lacrosse, as we've mentioned before, it's getting much more positionless on the offensive side. So they have principles, concepts, triggers, if you will, that initiate the offense. And one of them is a player dodges down the side or top side. And one of their principles is that they have another player that's set to mirror that dodge. So whichever way the ball, it's like an option, whatever way the ball goes, that player pops opposite. And so Deemer did a nice job of exploring some different, versions of that mirror and that pop behind the dodge and how it differs if the ball goes down the side, if it goes to the middle, if, the angle of the dodge changes, that popper can change what's happening on the backside. And defensively, we talked about like one of the most obvious ways, and a lot in the men's game at least, is players want to slide off the mirror, because what the mirror does is put themselves under the dodge where you feel like you're the perfect person to slide, but then that player pops to a spot which is hard to help to sometimes. And so on the men's side, we just talked about like the two real options of you can slide and support off the mirror, particularly if it goes down the side, holding that ground underneath. But when the ball goes to the middle, being more cautious there. I think, Deemer, you sent me some interesting clips looking at the women's sliding. There's obviously different rules in shooting space and just what, the range that players shoot from, 3 seconds and a lot of that. But I do think like a general principle that I always come back to is when you're looking at sliding, one, sliding on launch point matters. So are you at a good point to slide and stop the ball carrier? And two, can your help get to the player you slide from in time before they can shoot? And so typically when the ball goes down the side, the mirror pops towards the backside and you can help to that. When the ball goes across the top to the middle, it gets a lot harder to support to that. And so you see a lot of offenses, if a team takes the middle and they slide off the mirror, that quick throwback to a shot. And so like, I do think like one reason that we wrote about that, Deemer, and it's a big topic, is it's like the initiating factor in a lot of offenses, men's and women's lacrosse. And if you're an offense, you probably want to plan on how you can use that mirror and your reads off it. And if you're a defense, you do want to plan for how you support off of it. And there's different reasons if you would slide off of it or not. But I do think if you're a coach, if you're a player, if you're a fan interested, like understanding that principle and concept around the ball allows you to understand a lot of ball side actions that happen.
Yeah, it's well said. And I think for anyone listening too, again, any women's coaches, it's really worth a read. It also makes me always think, why not, if we're not going to slide off the mirror, why not at least teach our defenders to hedge and show, to scare dodgers out of their dodging lane and then recover back quickly to the mirror? I think that's something that can be integrated in more women's defenses, especially as I think about like what's hard to teach offensive players to do in terms of the skill set needed for that. So that comes to mind a lot. And then I also wonder, if you do start choosing to slide off of it, how much is it dictated by shading on your approaches and forcing in one direction versus, being more straight up in terms of allowing the dodger, playing them more square and allowing them to take either direction? How much does that come in to play for you, Matt?
I think that's like the most important part. And probably I should have spoke about that earlier. In any game plan, you the first thing you need to determine, and people like to say like, every coach loves to go like, or people like that, X's and O's, like where do you slide from? Like, what would you do here? Like, who can do this? It all depends on like how you're playing the ball. Like everything depends on how you play the ball. And it gets to a point where like, if you can't take away certain things, it's really hard to slide to it. And you can X and O's it all you want, but a good team has too many options. And so I if I'm coaching, I have a plan about, and you can be by player. It could be like this player on this side. Like we want to approach them like this, because if you give them this, they're too good at skipping it through the defense. The player that pops off the mirror is too good at manipulating it. So we want to force them this way, because or at least make it hard for them to get this, because they're too good when they get this. And then, so you're saying, okay, well, there's probably, if we're going to take this away on the ball, then most likely they're going to go here and this mirror is going to happen. Here's how we want to support to that. So like, I do think you want to say like, it's not this like, oh, if they do this, we do this. It's like, hey, we want them to do this for this reason. So on ball, we want them to do this, and we're going to be ready off the ball for this because of that. And maybe have one or two scenarios like that, and you can do it by player.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you digging into that, guys. Awesome episode. Fired up for Final Four weekend. It's been a blast doing these podcasts. We'll have one more at least next week, recapping all the results, but looking forward to it. Enjoy the games. Thanks for tuning in. Please feel free to continue to share our podcast with other players, parents, and coaches. It really means a lot, and it's been really fun covering the season. So enjoy the weekend. Guys, have a great one.
All right, see you guys.
See you guys.